Welcome back. Let's talk about the law of one price and purchasing power parity. These will be important relations for us to use in the study of the exchange rate in the long run and the money market in the long run. So let's start with the law of one price. This one states that the price of the same good is the same across locations when expressed in the same currency. So the idea is the following. We're going to pick a particular commodity, a particular good. Let's say this eraser. We're going to think about the price of erasers in the US. This is a lowercase p. It's a dollar price in the US. So these are dollars per eraser. An important feature of the law of one price is that it applies to individual goods. That's going to be a major difference between the law of one price and purchasing power parity. So we have a price in the US, dollars per unit of eraser. At the same time, we have a price in Europe. This is, euros per eraser. So it may cost $1 to buy one eraser in the US, but you may have to pay 1.5 euros for one eraser in Europe. Now the question becomes, we need to express these two prices in the same currency. So I would like to turn this euro price into a dollar quantity. So I will multiply this price by the current exchange rate. The current exchange rate is dollars per euro. So let's see how the units work here. I can cancel out. Here I'm multiplying dollar per eraser, I multiply by dollar per euro. So I can cancel out the euro, and together this will be left dollars per eraser. So that's what we have also on the left hand side where we are looking at the US price. So if the law of one price holds, you have to pay the same amount of dollars to buy an eraser in the US, and you have to pay the same amount of dollars to buy an eraser in Europe. So the takeaway is the following. For the law of one price, we will usually write LOP. The price of the commodity in the US has to be the same with the price of the commodity in Europe multiplied by the dollar per euro exchange rate. Your textbook has some nice discussion of the failure of the law of one price. It's related to this discussion of using very standardized goods like the Big Mac and stuff like that, and then checking the price in different countries and then turning all of those prices into dollars using the exchange rate. So there's a nice discussion of that in the textbook. For our purposes, we need to be able to apply the law of one price to convert prices in different locations into the same currency, usually the dollar. Now I want to contrast the law of one price with purchasing power parity. This is PPP. This will be very similar to the law of one price, but instead of being a statement about individual goods, it's going to be a statement about the US price level, the overall price index. So it's going to come into two flavors. We're going to have absolute PPP and then we will have relative PPP. For our purposes, we will need to know both, but in different stages of the derivation of our main diagram, we will rely on one or the other. I'm going to start with the absolute PPP. It says that if I look at the price index in the US, this is an uppercase P. I'm doing this bold double vertical line to emphasize that it's an uppercase P. So this is the price index in the US. If you want to think about the consumer price index, that's the CPI, or the personal consumption expenditure, that's the PCE price index. But some relevant US price index that captures the cost of living for a basket of goods that consumers buy. So I have a dollar value, a dollar price for the consumption basket in the US, and a euro amount for the price index for the basket in Europe. So it may take $100 to buy 1 unit of the consumption basket in the US, some sort of mixture of different commodities in proportions that US consumers buy. And then it may take 150 euros to buy the same basket in Europe. What purchasing power parity says is that when these price indices are expressed in the same currency, then the cost of living should be the same everywhere when expressed in dollars. So this will be the equation for absolute purchasing power parity, and we said the intuition is the following. Same cost of living in all locations when expressed in the same currency. So when we compare the dollar cost of living in the US and the dollar cost of living in Europe, based on the euro cost of living in Europe and the spot exchange rate, these should be the same if absolute PPP holds. This is the price for a unit of this basket. So one thing to keep in mind is that consumers in different locations may afford more or fewer baskets, but the price of the basket would be the same under PPP. So that's the sense in which the cost of living is the cost of living per unit of the basket. And so you see that it's very similar to the law of one price. It's essentially the same equation, except that with the law of one price we think about the price of particular commodities, in our example the eraser, whereas with PPP we think about the entire consumption basket of the household. This is the absolute purchasing power parity condition. We're also going to work with relative purchasing power parity. The relative purchasing power parity is essentially the absolute one, but expressed in growth rates. So then what we get is the following. The growth rate of the left-hand side is the rate of inflation in the US. So this is US inflation. Inflation is the growth rate in the price index. So this may be something like 1% or 2% in the US. Then on the right hand side we have the growth rate of a product. So you might remember from our log approximations that the growth rate of a product will be the sum of the growth rates. So under relative PPP, inflation in the US is matched by inflation in Europe. And the percent change in the exchange rate. And this percent change in the exchange rate will be the rate of dollar depreciation against the euro. So when this is high and positive, it means that the nominal exchange rate is growing fast, and we said the higher nominal exchange rate, that's a depreciation. So it takes more dollars to buy. It takes more dollars to buy 1 euro. When this is negative and the exchange rate is actually shrinking over time, that means that the dollar is appreciating. It's a strong dollar. The fewer dollars are able to buy the same euro, or for the same amount of, for the same dollars you can buy more euros. So that's going to be our key equation for relative PPP. So there are some important implications here. We're going to use relative PPP in our study of the long run. And so that's going to tell us about long run trends in exchange rate movements. In particular, I want to emphasize the following implication of relative PPP. So in the long run, we're going to assume relative PPP holds, and that's not going to be a bad approximation. And so I'm going to use this to think about the long run evolution of the nominal exchange rate. I'm going to solve for the object of interest. And what I find is that if inflation is higher in the US than in Europe on average, if dollar inflation in the US is greater than the inflation rate in Europe for the euro, then the right hand side is positive, and so that means that the US dollar depreciates over time. So over time, as long as US inflation is higher, the dollar becomes weaker and weaker in nominal terms. The opposite is true if inflation is lower in the US. So if US inflation is less than inflation in Europe, then the US dollar appreciates over time. So that means we have a stronger dollar. Finally, let me remind you that statements about depreciation and appreciation always work mirrored. So if the dollar is appreciating against the euro, then it must also be the case that the euro is depreciating against the dollar. So statements about depreciation and statements about appreciation or depreciation, they're always relative to a pair of currencies. So one currency appreciates, the other depreciates against each other. So you have to be careful about exactly what I'm telling you in the statement of the problem. I may tell you something about the euro appreciating against the dollar. You should immediately translate that into a statement about the dollar, that if the euro is appreciating, then the dollar is depreciating, or the other way around. So that's going to be an important detail to keep in mind, exactly which way we're stating these changes. So we will use relative PPP in our study of the money market in the long run. And also we were going to use absolute PPP to make statements about changes in expectation over future exchange rates. And the law of one price will mainly be useful for us in thinking about real exchange rates much later in our lectures.